Welcome back. It's been a long time. I just watched the Raptors lose game 1, so if I'm pissed, I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. This episode, we're talking about moderate optimism. And the question that's at the basis of this episode is there a rational reason for us to be optimistic? So, a couple of things before we get into that. We started a Patreon. So if there's anybody out there who is enjoying this thoroughly, other than myself, of course, because I'm having a great time, who wants to support the show, I think I price things fairly enough. I don't know. I have no clue. But if you're enjoying the show and you want to help keep it on everything, because, it requires a little bit of money to keep it on the podcast players, then go ahead and help us out, and I will be forever grateful. If not, who cares? Anyways, in this episode, we talked about economic optimism. I don't know why I'm saying we. It was just me. I had a great time. I talked about economic optimism. I talked about wealth inequalities, the wealth inequality, as well as absolute and relative poverty. And then finishing up in the second part of the episode, I talked as well about climate optimism and how our human impacts are affecting the earth, but my position that we should still be optimistic about all of these things. So I hope you guys enjoy. The only thing I will say is that at the end of the second part of this episode, actually a couple of minutes into the second part of this episode, the video runs out. There wasn't enough space on my phone. I'm sorry. I'm trying. But we're here. We're living. Welcome back. Season 2. I'll see you guys later. Thanks for listening. All right. So we're finally back. I have taken a full trip around the sun, as have all of you, so I don't know why I said that. Doing some learning for school, learning outside of school, just trying to figure out my existence here and the next purpose for me. Because after I finished playing basketball, it was a whole culture shock. That was almost everything to do with my whole life for like 12 years. Was not that long. 8 years of my life. So I'm happy that you guys are back for the second season of Fork in the Road to do some more learning. And this week we're talking about moderate optimism. And basically we're asking, is there a rational reason to be optimistic? So all of our sources are going to be where they normally are. And I hope you guys are ready to have a nice little conversation. Evidently, I should address this. It's just me this week, but almost every other episode this season should have a guest, and I think you're going to really enjoy them. It's not going to be identical to season 1, but the format is going to be very similar, and we're going to be learning. So that's all that really matters. So I want to start off by saying, in my opinion, the whole vibe in society right now is that the world is falling apart. And you could logically argue that the present is way better than the past. So I don't really understand why the media, the education system, just casual conversation in general is really being geared towards the negative, towards the fact that the world is falling apart and there's nothing that we can do about it. Evidently, there isn't really much that I can say that I've researched myself and come to conclusions myself about this, but a majority of the information that I'm basing my argument and my positioning on moderate optimism is based off of the Rational Optimism podcast that Jordan B. Peterson produced, featuring Matt Ridley. So, like I said, all our sources are going to be where they normally are. Matt and Jordan basically had almost a 2-hour-long conversation about the interplay between human tendencies, between biological evolution, between economic and wealth disparities and their interactions with our biology and with society as of right now. So I'm going to do my best to give you what I saw to be the most important parts of their conversation in a much more abridged way. But I also have information coming from my marine biology class that I'm currently in, my mechanisms of evolution class that I'm also currently in, as well as some just numbers, big old economic numbers that I don't understand whatsoever. But I asked my friend Wesley and I asked my friend Daniel, who I would argue are both way better when it comes to, who I would argue are both way more credible when it comes to talking about economic things. So while they weren't fully in support of my argument, they did look at my argument and help me alter it for it to be more factual. So I'm hoping that even though I know absolutely nothing about numbers or the economy, I can find a way to explain these graphs to you so they actually mean something. At the start of Matt and Jordan's conversation, they were talking about how humans have a tendency to put too much weight on negative information and how this is a survival instinct, because back when we weren't living in the most comfortable time of our lives, as we are right now, I would argue, we had to make sure at all times that things were not killing us, right? And for that to occur, you need to take more weight on the negative information, the stuff that could affect you, that could affect your family, that could affect your ability to feed your family, regardless if you're a man or a woman. It's just the biological prescription of the time. But in terms of now and in terms of our views on society as a whole, they have found that we're more optimistic of our own individual lives than those of the larger society. So while we may be pessimistic that the world as a whole and our economy as a whole is falling apart, as an individual, I am optimistic that I'm going to be able to make as much money as I need to, and I'm going to be fine, and my people are going to be fine. And I would argue that that really isn't a perspective that is servicing anybody, but we'll get into that later. In Jordan Peterson's explanation, he's put the most optimistic viewpoint is our viewpoint of ourselves. And then over here at the least optimistic is the viewpoint of the planet. So it goes us, then our viewpoint of our city, a viewpoint of our province or our state, and then our viewpoint of our country, and then the larger society and the planet as a whole. Since we are wired with this negative information bias, the media sells us bad news because we ingest it at a higher rate than good news. If everybody was willing to read the 20-page article about Jimmy John, who just made it out of the mud, and now he's cured cancer, and it's absolutely phenomenal, and it's a great story, and everybody loves to hear it, as opposed to clicking on the article about the predator who is running amok in the country, taking little children. Obviously, you need to put attention onto that because that is a crime that is going to affect a bunch of people's families across the country. But we're putting more weight on that than the accomplishments of society right now, currently, to the point where people are under the impression, or at least in my opinion, that there's nothing we can do to fix the problems that are happening. And I'm going to be trying to put forward a case that we are doing what we need to be doing. And of course, we need to do more and then do a little more. But I also would say that in the time frame that we've become self-conscious about the effects, the human impacts that we're putting on the world, that we've done the best with the resources that we have, and hopefully we will continue to do so. So Matt Ridley says we have a biological basis for good and bad instincts. There is disagreement when it comes to this. A lot of people are on the side that our biological nature makes us selfish because of our principle of self-preservation, that we need to eat, that we need to exist and keep ourselves alive, keep us from harm. But there's other people like myself who argue that because we evolved to be social animals, we've evolved to be altruistic and self-sacrificing so that we can perpetuate the greater good for society. I'm learning in this evolution class of mine right now that as our hominin, which is like the group of animals that the humans evolved from, as our hominin clade developed from our common ancestor, species that didn't have as much or as developed of language capacities, such as Homo floresiensis, eventually went extinct. And there could be a million different correlations and causations as to why these species, such as Homo floresiensis, went extinct. But I'd hypothesize that as we develop more pronounced methods for auditory communication, we could spread information faster that was vital to our survival as a species, Homo sapiens, that the other hominin species lacked, which perpetuated the survival rate of Homo sapiens versus all these other members of the hominin clade, which allowed us to become the apex predators on the planet and become the only surviving species in the hominin clade, because the evidence does show that a lot of different members of these clades existed at overlapping time periods. Like, my research has shown that the Neanderthals were developed when it comes to their language capacities, and they existed at the same time as some of the earliest Homo sapiens. So it's interesting that they overlapped as societies, but only one of them thrived. And there's, like I said, a bunch of different hypotheses you could throw forward as to why, but I really do think that our heightened language and our heightened mind state it didn't force us to be altruistic and to try and help our neighbors, but across almost every knowledge base in every part of the world, one of the biggest rules is the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I think that comes from the fact that if we work together, we get things done faster, we get them done more efficiently, and we can do more in a shorter period of time. So that argument about the hominin clades, that would be the humans being able to communicate that if you hunt the green snakes, you're going to be fine. But if you hunt the red and black snakes, it'll kill you and your entire family. So that type of information being passed, sure, the Neanderthals could do it, but it's clear that our language as humans has evolved past those of the Neanderthals or of Homo floresiensis, because if it didn't, they would still be here with us. And to my knowledge, it's just us, man. We're the only ones who are still rocking around. So I'm not an evolutionary biologist, obviously, but I really do think that this is sound enough logic to work with, that we have a biological basis for both good and bad action, as Ridley puts forth. Because while our principle of self-preservation makes us selfish, I would argue that our language capabilities have developed us to be altruistic, and those societies have always ended up going the furthest. Now we get into the part of the episode where I have absolutely no clue what I'm talking about, because we're talking about numbers. and I don't know anything about numbers, but I did develop some thoughts on these things, and or at least I tried to do my due diligence when it came to researching and peer reviewing my statements about these economic values. So hopefully you can find some value in this, and if you disagree with me, please let me know and we can have a conversation about it, because that's the whole point. So this portion of the episode, and as Matt Ridley and Jordan Peterson's conversation developed further, they fell into the principle of economic optimism. And in my understanding, economic optimism is pretty simple at face value. It's the philosophical framework that the economy is going to continue to grow, and we are going to continue to be able to provide for the amounts of people that we are producing on a daily basis. I'm sure there's a more specific definition. I'm sure there's a better definition, but that's how Keaton understands it. So that's how I'm going to go, so that's how I'm going to go from. No, that's not English. Like, what the hell am I saying? So that's how we're going to operate. So, first of all, I think that being able to communicate and being moral beings allowed us to employ societal self-interest. And what I mean by that, and what Matt Ridley means by that, is that as we develop to talk and we develop to respect each other, we could really understand that helping each other was at the self-interest of us as individuals, but also every other person that we impacted as we were helping them. So Matt Ridley argues that this helped develop the division of labor within our markets. So having a manager, having a CEO, having lineman workers, having et cetera, to do certain portions of the jobs within our markets. But it also allowed, our communication also allowed the development of societal benefits, such as the price system. And Daniel Zamoyski, who you guys will be hearing from later in the season, explained the price system to me as the thing that allows for price rationing and resource allocation. So, like I said, I can't provide you any other insight but that, because I have literally no clue what that means. And I'm sorry, but I'm also not that sorry, because that doesn't make or break my argument. He also explained to me that specialization was very, very important. My example for this is that Henry Ford makes the trucks, Canada supplies the oil, and we'll all be better off for it. And by developing this specialization, it allowed us to share the economic wealth and specialized our portion of the worldwide trade, which gave countries, nations, specific cities, etc., their own specific values and how they could contribute to the larger society as a whole. And this trend has been loosely attached and seen in multiple societies. The example that Matt Ridley gave was a Northern Australian Aboriginal tribe that used to use seashells as a form of currency, and they would be trading stingray barbs for stone axes with other Aboriginal tribes. And there was evidence in the sand of these exchanges because they fossilized the axe marks being dragged throughout the sand between the two tribes. So, I believe if we do truly have a biological prerogative for both good and bad action, and history has shown that we use our communicative capabilities to foster more societal good action, then I think it's only logical to assume that our economic path should be one viewed optimistically. The crux of my argument for this is take this surface level example because, like I said, I don't understand this stuff. Places like New York and Los Angeles produce jobs that don't actually exist anywhere else. in my mind, I'm specifically talking about online influencers, whether that's a YouTuber, a TikToker, etc., whatever. They're booming in these metropolitan areas because they all congregate there. And the crypto market, which is something else that I have no clue about, is booming and falling and booming and falling. I think. I honestly don't know. But I assume if crypto continues to grow the way the debit and credit system did in the past, then crypto banks will eventually open up. And crypto miners that are operating the blockchain right now and getting paid will be operating the blockchain under government regulations and be getting paid. Which the crux of this argument is that as the world evolves, so will our technology and our economic market, which is why I believe there is reason to believe economically we're going to be able to hold an optimistic viewpoint, because in my life alone, the basic technology has gone from no cell phones. Well, when I say no cell phones, I mean no cell phones unless you're super rich, to flip phones for everybody, to I have a fully functioning computer in my pocket that's currently recording this podcast. You know what I'm saying? So if that type of technological evolution is happening at a surface level to the general public, just imagine what science is discovering when it comes to these type of things. So based on all of this, I would argue that taking an optimistic stance on the economy is justified, but like I said, I'm not a business student and I cannot speak to the actual trends of the economy. I apologize about my chair in advance. I like it a lot, but when I lean too far in one direction, it might go. But I don't think it's that big of a deal, so I don't think you guys should worry about it. Now, even though I just said that I can't speak to like the broader concept of the economy, I have friends who can, and I ask them questions. Starting off with Wesley Sherrard, who we've done an episode of What Makes You Happy with. He is currently enrolled at the University of Calgary in a Bachelor of Commerce, and he explained to me that while the world GDP, which is the total measured and known output of an economy, is trending downward after COVID, the stats from the World Bank, which you'll be able to see if you're watching this, but I'll also link them in the description, are showing that the G10, which is Belgium, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, the UK, and the United States, who are basically a big group of powerhouses who consult and cooperate on economic and fiscal, financial matters, blah, blah, blah. All of their GDPs as individual countries are trending upward after COVID. So he supports my statement that an optimistic outlook on the economy is logical. But my friend Daniel Zamoyski, who is studying economics at the University of Alberta, has also let me know that just because GDP is trending upward, that alone is not a rational reason to have an optimistic outlook on the economy. However, he also says that the clinching factor that would keep the economies from booming isn't really the GDPs. So I was looking at the wrong numbers. One of the big factors would be that until there's significant technological advancements made, the networking that's needed between people to keep our economies worldwide moving forward is going to continue to be lacking. Because if there is a producer of, let's say, those microchips in the back of our phones that's in a remote village in Tibet, and we need them all in America, and America has no way to get into contact with that village in Tibet, what are we supposed to do, right? So Daniel actually says that is going to be affecting the outlook of the economy more. But based on the GDP and what I understand about the GDP, if these 11 countries are doing really, really well, that's good for the world as a whole. However, we'll get more into this later. It can't just be those 11 countries doing well. for everybody else to also be doing well. We need to find a way to fix issues of relative and absolute poverty. But like I said, we'll get into that later. So the next portion of the conversation moved into wealth inequality. And from my understanding, the conversation that Jordan Peterson and Matt Ridley had was concerning wealth inequality between individual persons, as well as the top 1% and the bottom however many percent, as well as nations. For me, I'm specifically going to be talking about wealth inequality from the top 1% to the bottom 75%, because that was the data that the World Bank and the article by, I don't know what the G stands for, I'll look that up and you'll obviously know later, Zuckman wrote about global wealth inequality that I did my research on. So the figure that you would be seeing right now if you're watching this is that the distribution of wealth, at least in China, Europe, and the United States, from the top 1% to the bottom 75%, shows that while the rich are still getting richer, from 1960 to 2020, so are the bottom 75%. The wealth threshold for an individual to be in the top 1% in this graph is 1,125,000 euros. According to Ridley, the rose-tinted view that life was better in the past was really only held by the wealthy, because at the time, say in the 1960s, they were the ones who could afford luxury, they could afford private transportation, they could afford medicine, and they had a stable income to keep their families fed. So in their minds, the world was great. But to the general, real people, our lives are only getting richer right now, because we can increasingly, depending on your situation, because I'm speaking obviously from a perspective of somebody who lives in Canada, we can increasingly afford the aforementioned luxuries, private transportation, medicine, food, etc., etc. Peterson also says that the average middle-class person in North America and Europe, and he attests to increasingly elsewhere in the world, is wealthier than a billionaire was in 1920. And obviously, that's kind of hard to grasp at face value, because it's like if they were a billionaire in 1920, they must have had $1 billion, and I can for sure as hell tell you that I don't have $1 billion right now, but their net worth was $1 billion at some point in 1920. The middle class person in North America or in Europe has seen the same amount of money as a billionaire did in 1920, or at least that's how I interpreted it.